Thanks, Angela, and good morning, church. This month we're learning about what it means that we are created in God's image. Human beings are the apex of God's creation. We're unique among all that He has made, and we stand in a special place of both privilege and responsibility. So last week we saw that there are 7 primary characteristics that are included in this image of God that we say. Rationality, the capacity to reason, to imagine. Personhood, knowing myself as a distinct individual. Communication, the ability to express my ideas, feelings, and intentions so that others can understand me. Relationship, capacity to form meaningful, loving relationships with others, including God. Creativity, the capacity to reproduce biologically, to create meaningful and significant products and processes and ideas, systems, artistic works. Rulership, authority and capacity to govern oneself and others for whom one is responsible. And then responsibility, ability to freely respond to God, to freely choose one's actions, the moral duty to obey Him. The characteristic that we emphasized last week was that final one, responsibility. Because unlike animals, human beings are created with an internal sense of the reality of right and wrong, and the recognition of a moral obligation to do what is right. The biblical basis for that moral awareness and the sense of obligation comes from the closing verses of our passage today, Genesis 2, 16 and 17, which contains God's initial command to our first parents. The Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." Now let's note a few key points about this initial command from God. First, the command, it's not an arbitrary demand that stands on its own. Rather, it flows out of God's blessing and His provision for mankind. The blessing, which we'll look at in a moment, is found in chapter 1:28, and the provision is spelled out in 1:29 to 30, and then again in 2:8 and 9, and it's restated in 2:16. God's gracious and abundant gift of life and all that humans needed is the essential context for understanding what He commanded Adam and Eve. Second, His commandment was a limitation on human freedom. God did not create a world in which it was impossible to transgress His will, where His decree determined everything that happened. Nor did He create humans as beings who were incapable of resisting His will. What He created was a world in which they were given everything that they needed and a command that required their conscious obedience. And only in this way could they be tested to see if they would choose to abide by the limitations that God put upon them. And those limitations, in effect, formed a boundary. Within that boundary, they were completely free to enjoy all that God had given them. How they lived, what they did, were entirely within their capacity to decide, guided by God's directions and His blessing. They could not change the world He had made. That is, they could not make it something that it was not or change the nature of the universe. They could not change their own natures. But the world that He had created had nearly limitless possibilities for what it could become under their care. And the same was true for humans. They had nearly limitless possibilities for what they could become as they lived under God's guidance and direction, remaining within His boundaries and following His will. The world was designed for them, and they were designed for it. All they needed to flourish was within their grasp. The resources that God had provided, the opportunities to learn and to grow, and the direction and the instruction which they would need from God Himself, who was present with them, guiding and directing and instructing and accompanying them. Third, the commandment made it clear that God was still the sovereign in this world. He was still the rightful king and the ruler of the universe and humanity's Lord. But by giving a command which required a response, God makes it clear how He would exercise His sovereignty. For such a command implicitly requires the capacity for the person who is addressed to freely choose how to respond. This is a different type of command than we see when God spoke the commands that created the universe. In those commands, he simply spoke, and what he said happened. No one was addressed. But in this command, a person is addressed and given an option with two possible outcomes. Such a command necessarily requires that the person who is addressed has the capacity to either comply with the command or not. That God was sovereign did not mean that he would control all those who were a part of his realm. Sovereignty did not mean that he had predetermined everything that would happen, every thought, every action, every outcome. Sovereignty meant that God had predetermined what kind of a world he would make. One in which human beings would be free to choose whether or not they would obey his commands. And that is an essential and unchangeable characteristic of the universe that God freely and purposefully created. Sovereignty for God also means that God is the one who freely determines how he will respond and how he will interact with his creation. He has determined what the consequences are for disobedience to his will. He has determined how and when he will bring those consequences about, how and when he will intervene, and to what extent he will personally involve himself in caring for and guiding the development of his creation. And he is the one to whom every person is accountable for how they have lived in this world that he has made. That is why we can say that responsibility, this ability to freely respond to God and the moral obligation to obey his commands, is the most essential characteristic of the image of God which humans bear. That ability is at the core of what it means to be human. Have the ability to freely respond to God and the moral obligation to live according to his will. Now, Genesis 1:26 points to another aspect of God's sovereignty, and that is his free and purposeful determination to create human beings. Just as we see in the rest of Genesis 1, God was not compelled to create the universe because of anything outside of himself. The universe exists because he decided to create. As I pointed out last week, it is the creation of human beings that shows us God's intention. Why did he create this universe? All that he made from the beginning was made to provide a place for human beings. Verse 26 shows us that it was God's will for people to exist and to bear his image. We are here because he wanted to share himself with us. Why does that matter? Because we need to connect verse 26 to 27 to 30 if we want to rightly see what God is trying to tell us through the creation narrative. Verse 26 demonstrates that God had a purpose in creating human beings. He had a reason, a clear idea of what he was doing and why he was doing it. Verse 27 tells us that he followed through with that intention, that the creation of human beings fulfilled God's express purpose of filling this world with beings who were capable of responding to him through a relational connection to him and then representing God in a special way. Verse 28 then follows with God's pronouncement of a blessing on human beings, and that blessing expresses his purpose for us. It tells us what God intended, what he wanted for humans when he made us. God's blessing represents the very best possible life it is possible to live, the very best outcome for his creation. God's blessing is his pronouncement of what will bring about the best good so that we experience life at the optimal level of productivity and enjoyment. It is his blessing that provides the enabling power to achieve that optimal level. His word declares what the best good is, and that's life according to God's way and God's will. And his word then empowers those who receive the blessing to carry out his intended purpose that is expressed in the words of the blessing. Now, there are 5 aspects of God's blessing, 5 directives indicated by all the verbs in verse 28. And this is important to note. These directives are not commandments in the sense of being moral demands we are required to fulfill in order to please God. They are the expression of God's blessing. Text clearly tells us that. So in verse 28, we can say that this verse does not command every married couple to produce as many children as they are physically capable of cranking out. Okay? It is a declaration of the blessing of God upon humanity that includes the potential for reproduction. So let's start there. The first aspect of this blessing is be fruitful. Fundamentally, this part of the blessing refers to the capacity to reproduce, to bear children. God created humans as male and female, 2 distinct sexes, in order to produce children so that the human race could continue. Fruitfulness, the capacity to reproduce, is a mark of God's blessing. That means that God considers, the sexual union of a man and a woman within marriage, as the Scripture makes clear elsewhere, to be something that's good, not dirty, not shameful. It is a part of God's good plan for human beings. And that also means that God considers children to be a blessing, not a burden. They are an essential part of God's intention for humanity, part of His plan to bring the highest good to us. But fruitfulness extends beyond merely producing children. Fruitfulness is a characteristic of the life of God. God is the source of all life, and we see in His creation what happens when, out of the abundance of His life, He produces anything. So whatever is born of God, whatever shares in His life, whatever reflects His creative power, will reproduce and extend His blessing through multiple generations. God is continually revitalizing the earth, and much of that comes through the people that He has made who bring His fruitfulness into their part of the world. Now, the second aspect of God's blessing is closely tied to the first. He says, increase in number, multiply. Again, fundamentally, this refers to the numerical increase of the population. A couple becomes a family. Family becomes a clan. Clans become a tribe. Tribes become a nation. Nations become a civilization. But more generally, increase is characteristic of God's blessing. Whether that increase is growth in numbers or in influence, in understanding and abilities, or some other quality, if a person or a family or a people is fulfilling God's intention for them, walking in His blessing, they will experience increase. I was talking with our oldest son recently. We were marveling together over God's blessing that we've seen in our family over his lifetime. And we can trace the marks of that blessing directly to what God planted in us, in Mary, my wife and I, through my mom, through Mary's parents, and to our own decision to build our marriage on Jesus. And then on our son and his wife carrying on by their decision to build their marriage on Jesus. And we can point to specific, identifiable places in which our lives and the lives of our children have seen an increase of good because we've been following God's ways. I'm better situated than my mom was. My children are better situated than we were because of the increase of God's blessing. The third aspect of God's blessing is also closely tied to the first two. Fill the earth. When God created people, He intended from the beginning for them to move beyond the place where they started. He wanted people spread out all over this planet, in all of the places where they could live. It's pretty amazing when you see some of the places where people live. I mean, people where they thrive, despite the difficulties of that particular place. Maybe a place that you would say, I wouldn't live there. But people do, quite well. This world is so incredibly varied in its topography and its climate. Deserts, frozen tundra, rugged mountains, thick equatorial jungles, tiny islands, dense forests, vast savannas, swamplands, river canyons, sweeping plateaus, and people live in all of these places. God's vision for humanity is expansive, not constraining. When we're living according to His ways and in His blessing, our mindset needs to align with God's purposes, which bring abundance rather than scarcity. The life of God leads to fullness, to flourishing, not just getting by. Now, circumstances might force us into a situation that is less than what God intends for people. We may well have to endure hardship, perhaps even great impoverishment. Whether that's due to our own failures or the oppression of others, that is possible. But that is never God's ultimate design for us. It's never where He wants us to end up. And even in those situations, God's blessing will bring increase to us. When we follow Him, He brings an increase of good to us. I grew up with very little, but I saw the increase of good in our family because of what God was blessing us with. The fourth aspect of God's blessing can surprise, can even shock us. He says, subdue the earth. So if the prospect of spreading throughout the entire earth wasn't enough of a challenge, this part of the blessing certainly would get your attention. And the reason is that this word subdue usually refers to hostile action. It's the word that you would use to describe what a conqueror does to his enemies, or what an assailant does to his victim. It's often used to describe an action of establishing dominance over a reluctant subject. But the word doesn't always have to imply harshness or brutality, as those examples would suggest. The basic idea of this Hebrew verb is to place one's feet upon something, that is, to take possession of a thing or a place, to bring it under one's dominion. Subduing the earth, thus, would imply taking possession of it, spreading out through all the earth, and making every location part of humanity's domain. Yet this word does imply something else besides the simple act of acquiring property for one's possession. It implies that making the earth or any part of it the domain of human beings will require overcoming some opposition. If the human family was going to spread throughout the earth and make it fruitful, there would be a cost. Subduing the earth would not come easily. Years ago, on a mission trip to Panama, the missionary I was visiting showed us an empty lot right next to his home in Panama City. And the lot was overgrown with really thick vegetation. The missionary told me that the owners of that lot had to cut it back quite frequently, or the jungle would simply take over. If they let it go for as much as a month, the growth of the jungle in that single lot would start to overwhelm the surrounding homes on the block. There was a ferocity, a relentless tenacity inherently contained in the trees and the other vegetation in that part of the world. The Panamanians had built a city there. They'd carved it out of the jungle. But the jungle wasn't going away. And subduing the land required a constant effort to maintain what they had built. Think about this example. Mining is one of the oldest and most essential industries in human history. Mining gives us access to some of the most crucial things we need for survival and for the advancement of human societies: minerals, metals, fuel sources, all of which are gifts God has placed in the earth, resources that are hidden away underground. Those resources have enabled the advance of civilization for thousands of years. We even mark those advances in the ancient world by noting when humans began using bronze. We speak of the Bronze Age, or the Iron Age that followed that, when humans started learning how to use iron. Part of God's blessing and provision for human beings is the wealth of deposits of these kinds of resources throughout the earth and the acquired knowledge of how to obtain them. But mining is an activity that is fraught with difficulties, beginning with the issue of safety and health for those who work in the mines, as well as the need to mitigate the possible harm to the surrounding environment, something that has often been ignored in the rush to obtain the treasures of the earth. Subduing the earth and securing its good resources for the benefit of people through mining requires a great deal of difficult work. Or take something as simple as farming. And anyone who knows anything about farming knows that it isn't simple. But it's pretty basic and a common activity across the globe. But think about the enormous variety of differing landscapes and ecosystems and climates across this earth. They all require very different systems and methods of farming in order to bring out the goodness of that land in the form of crops for food. Subduing the earth, overcoming the opposition of differing soils and different ecosystems, different growing seasons, different weather patterns, and so much more. This was God's plan for humans, something that would require His blessing, something that would require His instruction if we were going to make the land and the people who lived on it flourish. Now, the fifth aspect of God's blessing is perhaps the hardest to understand. Rule over, and then he lists all the kinds of animals. On one hand, it's pretty straightforward. As God's image bearers, His representatives, we've been given the responsibility to govern the earth, to make this world flourish. Humans were blessed by God to be the dominant species. We were given authority to rule over the animal world. Humans were in charge, not the animals. What does it mean to rule over the animals? How do you govern birds or mosquitoes or polar bears? Right? It certainly doesn't mean that humans should expect to be obeyed when they give commands to the fish or the birds or the creepy crawly things. I'm sure you wish you could do that and drive all the bugs and such out of your yard into someone else's yard and maybe pull a St. Patrick move and get rid of all the snakes in your neighborhood. That doesn't appear to fit with what God's trying to tell us in Genesis 1:28. God gave human beings the responsibility to oversee the earth, to bring it to its fullest fruitfulness. And to do that, humans are given authority over the animals. We rightly fulfill that directive by domesticating animals to do work or to provide food or clothing or fuel or protection. We also fulfill that directive by responsibly managing populations of animals so they don't destroy the land or overwhelm their respective ecosystems. And we also fulfill that responsibility by preserving and protecting the environment so that animal life can flourish and so that the earth can sustain the human population. Caring for the environment is not a cause for progressive politicians who oppose free markets. It is the responsible commitment of those who understand that we are accountable to God for how we fulfill His mandate to make this world and its people flourish. Christians, not leftists, ought to be at the forefront of caring for this earth, stewarding it well, because we know that we'll give an answer to God for how we've done it. So these 5 aspects of God's spoken blessings over the man and woman He'd created show us a great deal of what God has purposed human beings to be, to do, why He made us, what we're here for. There are 2 other really important things we have to add. We find them in the closing part of our passages today. In Genesis 2:15, God says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." God put the man in the garden to work it. He gave him a job to do. Human beings were created and blessed with a capacity to work, to do labor. And the only way to realize the fullness of His blessing is to do what we were created to do, and that is to work. Work is a gift from God. It is not the curse of the enemy. Okay? Having a job or working at home is part of God's purpose for being alive. It is God's way of providing for His people. Children are a blessing. but raising them takes an enormous amount of work. The resources that God has placed in the earth, the information and the knowledge that humans have acquired over millennia, the skills that have been developed and passed down through master craftsmen, these are all great blessings, but they require time and effort and dedication if we're going to realize the fullness of that blessing. Fruitfulness takes work. Subduing this earth and maximizing its potential takes concerted effort over generations. Work is God's way of enabling us to do what He created us to do, to bring the best out of this earth. It's also God's way for developing us as His representatives so that He can bring out the best in us as we learn and we improve and we grow to be more like what we were meant to be. Work's also necessary because working is a part of rulership. Now, that may not be self-evident to everyone, especially if you think of rulership as simply sitting somewhere on a throne and giving commands. But that leads us to the final point, which in many ways is the most important point we need to remember. God put the man in the garden to work. He gave him a job to do. But He also put him there to care for it. In other words, his job was not just to do certain tasks. His work, his purpose, the expression of what God had blessed him to be and to do as His viceroy, to rule over this world, to subdue it, to bring it to maximal fruitfulness, we can sum that all up by saying that his work was to care for the place that God had given to him. This is the key, understanding what our purpose is, why God has put us here, what we're supposed to be doing. Our creation mandate is to care for that which God has given to us. Continuing to use the imagery of gardening, since that's the picture we see in Genesis 2, we are here to cultivate the part of the earth that is our responsibility. We're here to protect it from harm, to enhance it, to bring it to maximum goodness, so that the land, the environment, the animals, the people are flourishing to the greatest capacity possible. We're here to rule over the earth, not as entitled tyrants exploiting everything around us for our own pleasure, but as wise stewards who know that we're accountable to God, who's the true king over this world. And we've been entrusted with a portion of this world so that we can make it and everything and everyone on it flourish. We are created in God's image. Every one of us bears that image. Each of us has been included in that blessing that God said over Adam and Eve. We've been granted rulership over this earth. We share that rulership with all humans as co-rulers over this world. And we've been given rulership over some small part of it. Even if that's only over my life, the room or the apartment or the home I live in, the job where I work, the family I'm a part of. My purpose here on this earth is to represent God wherever I am, to grow and help His kingdom grow, to overcome the resistance of this world, so that my life can bear good fruit and demonstrate what it looks like to come under the rule of God and to care for the people around me, the place that I inhabit, the environment that is my home, to cultivate whatever and whoever my life touches, so that this world and the people in it, the part of it that I touch, can see God's goodness more and more in real ways in their lives. As I follow Jesus, as I live out God's purpose for my life, I am helping to bring true fruitfulness to the people in my life, in the place where I live. That's why we're here.